I want to move on now to a second topic, another of positive psychology's greatest hits, dealing with stress. Stress has become a global epidemic. Our college students are suffering from this epidemic. Let me share with you a quick excerpt from an interview with Dr. Richard Caddison, who's the head of mental health services at Harvard University. Here he's talking about a national survey of mental health.
There's a national survey called the National College Health Assessment, and in the survey year after year, 45% roughly of students report being depressed to the point that it's difficult to function. And I think 80% feel overwhelmed. Now, not everyone is clinically depressed, but if there's that many people in distress, things need to be done about that, and most campuses don't have enough resources to reach out to those students. And they also don't want to come in because there's lots of stigma attached.
This is troubling. 80% feeling overwhelmed, 45% depressed to the point of not functioning. So what is going on there? When I was a resident tutor, one of my roles with undergraduates was to look over the resumes to help them get a better job. And one of the things that initially really impressed me was that each year these resumes became more impressive. The fonts became smaller, the margins became narrower, the titles became more grandiose. And it really impressed me until I realized the price that these students were paying for these narrower margins and smaller fonts. These students were overwhelmed. They were stressed. They had too much to do, trying to do more and more things in less and less time. Here is how it works. When we have too much to do, naturally, we feel stressed. And then over time, if this stress persists, and there's a lot of research showing this, it leads to depression or can potentially lead to depression. And it doesn't start in college, it starts much earlier. You know that in the 1960s, the average age for the onset of depression was 29. Today, the average age for the onset of depression is 14. Why? Because the stress begins so much earlier. There's also the physical cost. Ask any doctor, one of the primary causes of physical ailment is stress. Why? Because our immune system weakens. It's no coincidence that very often after a very stressful period at work or in school or in a relationship, we become sick. People lose their levels of creativity as a result of stress, thinking narrowly as opposed to broadly when we're more relaxed. Being overwhelmed, having too much to do is so prevalent. Some of our comedians even use it as part of their routine.
I believe that someday sitcoms will be 30 seconds long. Because that's all we'll need and that's all our attention span can take, because our attention span is shot. We've all got attention deficit disorder, or ADD, or OCD, or one of these disorders with 3 letters because we don't have the time and patience to pronounce the entire disorder. That should be a disorder right there. TBD, too busy disorder.
I'm looking at the Pop-Tarts box and I noticed they have directions on there. Microwave directions. Listen, if you need to zap fry your Pop-Tarts before you head out the door, you might want to loosen up your schedule.
So what do we do about this stress thing? What do we do about it on the personal level? What do we do about it as a culture, as a community? Think about the following analogy. Think about your favorite piece of music. You're listening to Whitney Houston's "And I Will Always Love You." It really is my favorite piece of music. And then you rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, and you give it a straight 10. And then you listen to your second most favorite piece of music, the chorus piece from Beethoven's Ninth. And once again, you rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, and it's not quite "And I Will Always Love You," but it's a 9.5. It's pretty good. And then, for maximal effect, you play them together. And what do you get? A 19.5, right? No, not a 10, not even a 5. It's noise. That's modern life for you. Simplify. We pay a very high price for trying to do too much, Quantity affects quality. The first thing we need to do is simplify. We need to do less rather than more. Nothing will happen if when we come home in the evening, we switch off our cell phone for a few hours when we spend time with our family and friends. This also applies in the workplace. Now, in the workplace today, it's impossible, unrealistic to eliminate multitasking, but it's certainly at times possible to reduce it. How many of you have your email on while you're doing other work that requires concentration? Just a quick show of hands. It's most people in our culture. I used to do that too, until I heard about this study. This study was run at the University of London. And what they found was that people who had their email on while doing work that requires concentration, it is the equivalent of losing 10 IQ points. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't afford 10 IQ points. It's a lot. Just to give you a sense of how much it is, if you haven't slept for 36 hours, you've been up all night, you lose 10 IQ points. Another point of comparison, if you smoke marijuana, grass, you lose 4 IQ points. But don't inhale. We pay a very high price for it. Leslie Perlow, professor at Harvard Business School, showed that knowledge workers who took as little as an hour and a half a day off focus time, time without distractions, not only were happier at work, they were also more creative and more productive overall. So it's a win-win all around. There's a lot to be gained for the individual as well as for the organization if we introduce that as a ritual. There's a lot of research showing the relationship between money and happiness. And what we know is that money is a very poor predictor of well-being, except for at the extremes. So of course, if you have a person who's homeless, and that person suddenly gets an extra $2,000 a month, of course it will affect their levels of well-being. But once basic needs are met, the need for shelter, for education, for food, additional money makes very little difference to our overall well-being. What does make a difference to our well-being? Time affluence. This is simply the feeling that we're not constantly chasing something, running away from something. It's the feeling, the knowledge that we have time to savor, to enjoy, to appreciate the things in our lives, whether it's work, whether it's our family and friends. Family and friends. The number one predictor of well-being. The number one predictor of what I call the ultimate currency, the currency of happiness. Time we spend with people we care about and who care about us. Do we take that time to savor, to appreciate, to love and to be loved? How basic, how simple, how important, and how missing from our culture today. Growing up in Israel, I remember my parents having their friends over. They would laugh a lot and they would talk a lot. They'd have a swell of a time. It looks very different from even the way my generation visits friends. So when we visit friends, we're on the phone or doing our email, distracted, not savoring, not enjoying, not making the most of the number one source of the ultimate currency. Let me show you a clip with one of the leading positive psychologists in the world, professor of psychology, Sonia Lyubomirsky from UC Riverside.
Friends and family is incredibly important. In fact, many researchers, I think, if you ask them, they would say that social relationships are the biggest factor in happiness and well-being. And social support has been shown to be important in coping with loss, coping with illness, with negative events, and also just with anything, with achieving goals. You know, having supportive friends or family that kind of, that inspire you, that cheer you, that motivate you, that give you tangible support.
Your most important source of happiness may be sitting next to you right now, right here. Do you appreciate that person? Do you make the most of that source of the ultimate currency? To my mind, the most surprising result in the area of stress research is that stress is not the problem. What psychologists have shown is that stress is often good for us. It makes us tougher, stronger, more resilient, and more receptive to happiness, to well-being. Think about the following analogy. On the physical level. So what happens to your muscles when you go to the gym and lift weights? You're stressing your muscles. What happens to the muscles as you're doing it? The muscles actually break down when they stress. But is that a bad thing? It's not a bad thing, because if you lift weights and then the following day you lift the same weights again, and then you lift the same weights again and again, day after day, after 6 months and then a year, and then after 2 years of lifting weights and working hard, you begin to look like me. More or less, well, hopefully a little bit more. So it's not a bad thing. Stress is actually good for us. When do the problems begin? The problems begin when we lift weights and then a minute later we lift the same weights again and then again and again and again. That's when we get injured. That's when we get overtrained. That's when we get enervated rather than energized. So the problem is not the stress. The problem is the lack of recovery. On the physical level, as well as on the psychological, emotional level. People who are successful, who thrive, and who are also happy are not people who don't experience stress. Especially in the 21st century, stress is part of being alive. They ritualize their recoveries throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the year, throughout a lifetime. What we need, if we are to thrive in this fast-paced world, is to strategically place recoveries on a few levels. First of all, on the micro level. What we need to do is introduce 15-minute breaks after an hour or 2 hours of work. That could be talking to our loved one. It could be meditating for 15 minutes. It could be having lunch with our phone off and email off. These mini recoveries make a big difference to our well-being as well as to productivity and creativity. It's a win-win. We need these recoveries on the mid-level. A good night's sleep is a very good investment. A lot of research tying good sleep to well-being, lower levels of depression, higher levels of happiness, as well as to creativity and productivity. It's a good investment to sleep. Or taking a day off during the week. Even God needed a day off. People who take a day off or 2 days off a week actually report being more productive, not to mention happier. And then we also need those macro level breaks, those vacations, the month off, the week off every few months. JP Morgan, one of the leading entrepreneurs in the history of American business, once said, "I can do the work of a year in 9 months, but not in 12. Now, most of us don't have the luxury of taking 3 months off. But the point is that we need that time off. It is no coincidence that there is an etymological connection between the words create and recreate. We need to engage in recreation if we want to be at our best. So introduce these rituals into your life, those 15-minute breaks, that hour gym a few times during the week. That quiet lunch where you savor a friend or the meal itself. Get a good night's sleep, take a day off, take those vacations without taking your computer along or being on the phone constantly, because that's not a real vacation. That's just more stress, this time about being on vacation.